Hello, I'm Mary Brownell, and I am the director of the CEEDAR Center. Today I won't be talking as much about CEEDAR. I'll be talking about one of the charges of the CEEDAR Center, which is to evaluate educator preparation. Tomorrow my colleague Paul Sindelar will be leading a presentation on the CEEDAR Center. So if you want to know more about it, I would recommend that you try to fit that session in. I am going to talk only about the evaluation of programs, not the evaluation of individual teachers, because I think that's an important distinction. There are three aspects of programs that we do try to evaluate. One is the selectivity of the program. The other is the content and the structure of the program, so the sorts of methods courses that are offered and the field experiences and the sequences in which those occur, and then the overall quality of the program. And I want to mention, before I go any further, Heather alluded to the fact that we're writing a paper with George Noel. That paper is going under review almost as we speak. It's finally ready, and so it should be ready for general dissemination probably in the fall sometime. So let me just talk about three of these issues. Heather and Nate have been very clear about the fact that we don't have much research in special education, so I'm going to talk mostly about what we do know from general education. There is data, and most of you are familiar with this, that teachers' academic ability has been tied to student achievement, particularly in the area of math, in multiple studies. But there's also one study out, and I think this is quite interesting, that demonstrates both the importance of cognitive and non-cognitive factors. So when you add teachers' dispositions and some of the ability factors together, you actually have a stronger signal for predicting who might be an effective teacher. So selectivity we have some reason to think how you select candidates and the quality of those candidates is important. Program content and structure. We really don't have a lot of vehicles for assessing program content and structure. The National Comprehensive Center for Teacher Quality, not to be confused with NCTQ, now the Great Teachers and Leaders Center, developed a lot of innovation configurations that faculty could use to analyze their coursework to see if those courses contained evidence-based practices. We're following up with that work at the CEEDAR Center. We don't know the predictive validity of that work, but it is a tool for examining what you're doing against an evidence base, which we do have, which is intervention research. There is a little bit of evidence. Lots of programs survey their students, their graduates, and ask them about their coursework and clinical experiences. Most of those surveys have no known validity. But there is a little bit of evidence by the authors that I have mentioned here. Bowe in special education showed that classroom management lent itself to identifying teachers who felt more well-prepared. And then Boyd, Grossman, and their colleagues have a study out that showed that teachers' ratings of graduates' ratings of certain aspects of their program, like their methods coursework and their clinical experiences, do have some signal for teacher effectiveness. So there's some promise with surveys if they're well constructed, but we certainly need to know a lot more about this. These are some of the more commonly used measures, well, two of them that Heather and Nate both talked about, and I want to talk about each one of these for a little bit. Heather was very clear to help us understand that the value-added scores can be used more at a bigger level of aggregation. Fang and Sass I don't know if all of you are familiar with that study, but Fang and Sass showed that teachers who have about 30 hours of preparation produce better student achievement gains for students with disabilities in reading and mathematics. The findings were stronger in reading than they were in math, but that was at a very big level of aggregation. So it was teachers with preparation versus teachers who did not have preparation. The problem comes as you try to drill down to individual programs rather than bigger comparisons like that. Some people in general ed, though, have been able to show that you can show programs that are more effective than others, and Goldhaber is one of those researchers. Supervisor ratings. Principals are able to identify some of the stronger teachers. And what's interesting to me, the Rockoff and Speroni study, they looked at mentor teachers, and I think that has some potential for special education, because mentor teachers in special education might be more likely to know about special education. That's not always the case, but they might be able to provide a better signal of who is an effective special education teacher. There's some worry about principals rating special education teachers. One of my colleagues, Tricia Steinbrecher, has just finished a study looking at what principals really understood about special education, and it wasn't very impressive. They really didn't have a lot of knowledge of what they would need to know to rate a special education teacher. There has also been some suggestion that we could look at retention rates. There's also some problems with this. If teachers leave the state and go to another state to teach, then they've left that state and they may show up as attrition when in fact they're not, but it is worth considering. And at this point, because we don't have a lot of data, probably the best guess is to collect different sources of data and look to see, does it produce any variability that we might have faith in among teachers depending on their individual quality and the program that they graduated from. I want to talk for a minute about some emerging practices that I think are interesting. My iLogs was actually developed to look at the sorts of content instruction that students with disabilities were receiving. And in my iLogs, there's a way for teachers to record both the time they spend on a content area standard, the level of the instruction, so is it just basic understanding, is it some higher level of application, and then the degree to which they're using evidence-based practices. Now, there's only one study that has connected this to student achievement, but students with disabilities did perform better when their teachers spent more time on the content area standards and spent more time at higher levels of application. Mostly those students with disabilities are not spending as much time on content area standards as general education students are, and maybe that makes sense because maybe they have to spend a lot more time on what Kurz and Elliott and their colleagues call custom skills, or learning some of the sub-skills that will allow them to achieve in the content area standards. Right now, we don't know the potential of this in an evaluation system. Teachers self-report, and so that there could be some, if the stakes are really high, there could be some incentive to cheat. But they are looking at it in New Jersey, Arizona, and Pennsylvania as part of an evaluation system for special education teachers. So I do think this is something interesting to look at. What I like about it from the perspective of a teacher educator is it might be able to identify areas that we're not spending enough time on in our teacher education or our professional development programs. There's also the EdTPA. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with it. It was developed at Stanford, and right now Pearson is the platform that's being used to pull in the assessment. Some states are adopting it statewide. Georgia is one of those states. I believe Illinois is another one. This is a performance assessment, but what's interesting about it is it has been designed specifically to think about ELL students, students with disabilities, if you're a general education teacher, and then it is designed specifically to assess special education practice for special ed teachers. But right now we have no knowledge right now of its technical properties and whether it's going to be able to discriminate between teachers. And I have some concerns that if it's hard to rate on Charlotte Danielson's framework for teaching and class, that this instrument, because of the way it's constructed, will have similar issues. I do want you to know that my iLogs actually, when teachers aren't using it for evaluation, they do tend to self-report in pretty valid ways, at least according to observations of those teachers. Then I want to bring this up because I think this is really interesting work. This is Deborah Ball's work and her colleagues, and I believe she's working with ETS on this work also. Deborah is looking at trying to identify high leverage practices that we should teach to teacher education students. And those are practices that they commonly find themselves doing, like making content explicit through explanation and modeling. That is one of her high leverage practices. So is leading a whole class discussion. And then there are 17 others. And what Deborah is trying to do is develop with her colleagues an observation system or a performance assessment system to go around these high leverage practices. She's also trying to look at what is the high leverage content that we should help teacher education students acquire. What I really like most about this work, beyond its capacity potentially to evaluate teacher education students, is if we can get some consensus around these practices and the content, we get some consensus around what's a vision for effective teaching. And the other thing that I like very much about it is it provides a place for us to have conversations about how might instruction for students with disabilities look different, perhaps, than the high leverage practice that's been identified for general education, or how might it extend that practice. For instance, when I saw leading a whole class discussion, I jumped right to the kinds of problems that students with disabilities would have in a whole class discussion, and what a special education teacher and general education teacher would have to do to alleviate some of those problems. So I think it's a really interesting framework to take a look at. So, in conclusion, what can we say about what we have right now? The assessment approaches that we have are going to require some modification for special education. I'm glad to know of Evelyn's work in Idaho and others who are working hard on this issue. I also think Nate didn't have his beautiful picture, but he makes a great point. We've been talking a lot about this, the need to assess team effectiveness. Special education is all about team instruction. So to view just the quality of one teacher seems conceptually very problematic. And when we were at ETS last year, we picked one of the great teachers from our previous research on effective special education literacy teachers. And this teacher under FFT and class would have been systematically downgraded if you watched her instruction all the time. But the bigger problem, I think, was the fact that she was so good, she was actually leading the intervention team. And she was helping the rest of the teachers plan the effective literacy instruction. And so what you really would have missed that was most important for the students with disabilities is what Paige was providing together with her colleagues. So we really have to find some way to capture this idea of team effectiveness. At this point in time, a combination of approaches is probably most prudent. And perhaps we could get access to work with, this is where researchers partnering with practitioners would be very helpful, access to state databases to see some of even the most fundamental things. Do special education teachers systematically score lower on these performance measures than general ed teachers? Is there enough variability in the database? So some of even the most fundamental things, not just is it tied to the achievement of students with disabilities.